Hi, folks. This is Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D. for the Institute for Dialectical Metarealism. I wanted to present a critique of academia in the First World, and particularly here where I am in the U.S. The U.S. itself has a very, well, let's say, egocentric or Amerocentric, which means American-centered approach to academia. When I went to school, K through 12, junior high school, now called middle school, high school, undergraduate, and graduate school, I was almost never taught about the third world. Never. Well, almost never. I shouldn't say never. I should say almost never. That's more accurate. But certainly the third world was nowhere near the center of our consideration. Even though the US has had colonies in the third world, we simply did not talk about it. The US, of course, has Puerto Rico, which is not technically a colony. Technically, it is a protectorate, which is actually the same status held by Washington, D.C. But we talked about Washington, D.C. a lot, but we never talked about Puerto Rico, or I can't recall ever having talked about Puerto Rico anyway. So if we did, I don't remember. Maybe so, maybe not, but it's not a part of my recollection, so I doubt it was emphasized that much anyway when I was a student. American academia is almost entirely focused on America. Should we expect that? No, definitely not. When you travel to other countries, that is not the way academia works. Many people, for example, who graduate from high schools in other parts of the world learn more about the United States than we learn right here in the US. That's how bad our educational system is. We have a really bad educational system until you get to the college and university level. And then it gets good or better, but my critique would apply to them as well. Mainly that the third world is not a focus. Unless I suppose you are majoring for a master's or a PhD in third world studies or in the studies of some particular third world country, you're not going to hear that much about the third world. I know that I never did. We had a course or courses in American history. We had courses in Western civilization. Again, the West, the first world. What about world civilization? What about global civilization? No. I was not even given that option. I could pick between US history and Western civilization. That was it. The third world was entirely left out. There was no option to engage in third world studies. Should there have been? I think so, but we simply didn't have it. A parallel to that, the news media. I began college wanting to be an actor. And I think I would have been a pretty good actor, to be honest. But I changed my mind after I realized that most actors ends up driving cabs or serving as servers in restaurants, which is not something I wanted to do. Some people are willing to sacrifice and do that, not me. I guess I didn't have sufficient motivation. So then I switched from being a theater major to being an English major, and then I ended up as a journalism major. My original idea was to become a broadcast journalist. I thought about primarily working in radio because I like radio. I've always loved radio journalism. When I was a kid, even after I was a kid, whenever I was in New York City, I was constantly watching WINS and WCBS AM, the two all news radio stations in New York City. I couldn't stop listening to them. I literally could not get enough. But what was I listening to? I was listening primarily to stories about the US, maybe secondarily to stories about other first world countries, primarily the UK, but hardly ever would we talk about our neighbor to the north, Canada, and even less frequently about our neighbor to the south, Mexico. So I knew virtually nothing about the rest of the world. I realized that. I knew a lot about the US, but not a lot about the world at large. Here I am, living just a couple of miles from Mexico, and I know nothing at all about that country, with few exceptions. I don't know its history. I don't really know about its demographics, nothing. I mean, I've tried to learn a bit when I go down there. Since I'm so close to it, I can almost throw a stone and have it reach the other side of the Rio Grande River. But it's hard because that's not what the foundation of my learning was. In studying to be a sociologist, I can't recall a single sociology course I took which focused on the third world. I'm pretty sure there was none. Possibly the third world was mentioned from time to time, but not that much. So whether you're talking about education or the media in the US, the focus is almost entirely on the US, which is something that is not true in most of the rest of the world. It simply isn't. And that is very sad. Again, the quality of education from kindergarten through 12th grade in the US is really, really bad. The quality of postgraduate education, being a college or university student, undergraduate and graduate, is pretty good, but still hardly any focus at all on the third world. When I was a student, that issue never really crossed my mind. And I guess because no one ever really raised the subject. So I never had time to think about it or the inclination to think about it. I think about it now all the time, but it's too late. In effect, all the knowledge I get about the third world has to come from my own studies, my own independent studies. So despite my love for the third world, I realized that despite the fact that I have a PhD in sociology, I have learned very, very little about the third world. Most of my education was about the first world. And even narrower than that, most of my education about the first world concerned the United States. There are a lot of difficulties with that. Canada recognizes that it is both an Anglo-Canadian and Franco-Canadian country. It recognizes that. That's a part of Canadian history. Quebec, especially Quebec City, is very, very French. It's not exactly the same as the French spoken in France, because there's a lot of slang expressions in French Canadian than there is in French per se, but still it's French. Here in the US, there is a similar situation. We have Spanish, which is spoken right here on the US side of the Rio Grande Valley. And then you have Spanish spoken on the other side of the Rio Grande Valley in Mexico. And people on both sides have a really tough time understanding each other. I remember a meeting that we had of our homeowners association. We all gathered together to meet with the board, basically to fight with the board. The board is no longer the board. We have a brand new board. And I heard these fights breaking out in the audience. I was in the audience. And the entire meeting was conducted in Spanish, basically. Occasionally a bit of English, but mostly Spanish, which was frustrating to me because sadly, I do not speak Spanish. I wish I did, but I don't. I'm trying to learn it gradually, but it is tough. Still, that fight in the homeowners association meeting was intriguing. And I asked somebody, what are they fighting about? Person next to me said they're fighting about the fact that they can't understand each other. And I said, but they're both speaking Spanish. Person said, yes, but one group is speaking Mexican Spanish and the other group is speaking Tex-Mex Spanish. And until then, I had no idea that they were different. Now I do. Tex-Mex Spanish, which is spoken where I live, and Mexican Spanish, right over the river, are not the same. And in some ways, they are mutually incomprehensible. If you speak one, you generally will not be able to understand the other. Occasionally, you can understand a bit of it, but there's so much English slang that has been thrown into Tex-Mex Spanish that it makes the two languages almost entirely different. Sounds kind of strange, but that's the way it is in the part of the US I live in, and in the part of Mexico I live right next to. Okay. Here is my critique. When I look at that situation about the differences between Mexico and the US in terms of language, I think of the character and the history of the United States itself. Large parts of what were once Mexico are now a part of the US through various wars. And those wars were very unfriendly. I'm not sure if a war can be friendly, but these wars were particularly unfriendly wars, and wars between neighbors. I was often afraid when Donald Trump was president that he was trying to trigger another Mexican-American war. Some of the things he said about Mexico were so horrible. I literally found it hard to imagine that an American citizen in the 21st century would say such disgusting things about our neighbor to the south. And yet that didn't stop Trump. And there is a reasonable chance that Trump may once again be the president of the United States starting in January of next year. And why is that a likelihood? Because Joe Biden has done such a bang-up job. I'm being sarcastic. Because of primarily right now, Joe Biden's support for the war in Gaza, both military support and financial support. Even though Benjamin Netanyahu, shows Joe Biden virtually no respect at all, Biden seems determined to keep on giving money to Israel. Why? I don't know. It makes no sense to me. Well, it makes some sense to me. After all, the US in the United Nations, in the UN Security Council, placed the deciding vote which created the nation of Israel. It wasn't the only country to vote in that way, but it was the last country that was needed to make Israel into an independent country. And so, from that standpoint, I can understand it. But supposedly, the US has a commitment to human rights. Where is that commitment to human rights when it comes to Gaza and the West Bank? How many Americans even ever heard of Gaza and the West Bank prior to the current war? I would imagine that most Americans now are aware of the Gaza Strip because of the war, but I would also imagine that most Americans have no knowledge whatsoever of the West Bank, or even that the place exists. What a tragedy, an absolute and total tragedy. And I never learned about either Gaza or the West Bank as a student. It was simply not discussed. Was Israel discussed? Occasionally. But most of the time was devoted to talking about the US, and a slightly lesser amount of time was devoted to talking about the First World in general, especially the UK. There is a fascination that Americans seem to have with the UK. The UK was, at least in my experience, talked about even more than Canada, although Canada is obviously our neighbor to the north, and yet Canada was hardly ever discussed at all. So just as Canada is both Anglo-American and Franco-American, we are both, in my opinion, Anglo-American and Latin American. In other words, in my view, here in the US, we are a part of Latin America. Large pieces of the US were once a part of Mexico. Here where I am, most people here speak Spanish. Many people here speak Spanish and English, and it's basically retirees, migrants to this area like myself who speak only English. I wish that were not the case with me, but that is the way it is. And yet we know virtually in the US nothing about Mexico, even though much of the US used to belong to Mexico, which is why I say that it is justifiable to refer to the US as a part of Latin America. And now there are Spanish-speaking people all over the US. In the last few decades, our Spanish-speaking population has rapidly increased. The number of Tex-Mex restaurants has increased as well, all over the country. So really, I don't understand why Latin America is still discussed as if it is the other. No, it's not the other. It is us. We are a part of Latin America, just as we are a part, along with Canada, of Anglo-America. And I think we should accept ourselves as such. There are a lot of Americans who are under the delusion, I guess is a good enough word, that English is the official language of the United States. No, it is not. We have no official language in the United States. Period. We don't. English is not the official language of the United States. It isn't. It really isn't. So, despite that, I periodically will mention, when I refer to this area, that historically this area was a Spanish-speaking part of Texas. And I will get responses back in anger. Like, how dare they speak Spanish? They're living in the US. As if somehow only English-speaking people have a right to claim to be Americans. Either it is based on a misunderstanding, and I guess that's partially true anyway, or it is based on complete and utter hatred toward Mexico and toward Latin America in general, even though we are a part of Latin America. Okay, so the concept of education in the US, the educational system in the US is very much geared toward an American education. I learned all about the United States, all about US history when I was a student, from kindergarten through graduate school. I learned almost nothing about the Third World. I learned some about European history and some about other first world countries at present, but about the Third World, almost nothing at all. Even parts of the United States that are primarily Spanish speaking, like Puerto Rico, I don't recall a single discussion of Puerto Rico when I was a student. Now, I might be mistaken. That could very well be, but at least I don't recall it. Guam itself, which is a colony of the US, was never discussed either. So we have a very narrow view of what it means to be an American. I mean, Puerto Ricans are American citizens. The status of Puerto Rico and the status of Washington, D.C. are exactly the same. They are both protectorates, not states. So when you are driving from Virginia or driving from Maryland, you cross over into the District of Columbia, you are no longer in a state. You are now in a protectorate. It is the same as flying or taking a boat, say from Florida to Puerto Rico. You are also going to a protectorate. And yet we think of Puerto Rico as somehow being the other. We think of it that way. In its last vote on the subject, Puerto Rico had three choices. One was to maintain its present status as a protectorate. Two was to become a state of the United States. And three was to become an independent country. Puerto Ricans chose to become a state. Why they would, I have no idea, but that's what they chose. If it were me, I would choose to become independent. But regardless, nothing has happened with that vote. Congress has not voted on it. Why? Well, for the same reason that Washington, D.C. would like to become a state, or at least part of Washington, D.C., the parts of it that are not directly surrounding the Capitol and the White House. But Congress has not voted on that either. So neither place, despite having voted to become U.S. states, has been considered to become a U.S. state. Neither one. Because Republicans don't want more Democrats voting in U.S. elections. That's it. That's it. Now, whether most Puerto Ricans would vote Democrat, I don't know. But I guess Republicans think they would. In terms of D.C., District of Columbia, I don't think there's much of a dispute. Most people in Washington, D.C. are Democrats, so that they have right. But it's just a shame that this kind of tribalism, which exists between the parties in the United States, has excluded two places from joining the United States. And again, it goes back to this very narrow view of what it means to be an American, or what an American should be in the minds of some people, a Republican. So the fact that I never, or almost never, learned about the third world as a student is disappointing. But what is even more disappointing to me than that is that I spent my entire career as a professor, retiring 1 year, 3 months ago. And in all my years working in higher education, I never was able to teach a course on the third world. Why? Because no such courses were taught. I could have made up my own course, a special topics course, as they're usually called. The problem with that is that at least where I was, special topics courses usually fail, meaning they are usually canceled out of small enrollments. Why? Because of the way they are listed in the catalog, in the online catalog. They're listed as special topics. And then the actual name of the course is given afterwards. So people will see, first of all, special topics. Then if you look in the small print, you may see what that special topic is. But most students don't do that. And so that is the reason why special topics courses usually don't make it. They are usually canceled. Some courses may end up with as few as one student enrolling in them. I once tried to teach a course in the sociology of religion, which is one of my two areas of specialization along with social theory. Despite that, and I had loads of students who told me, oh, please, Dr. Foster, teach a course in the sociology of religion. I would try to encourage my students to call me Mark, but a lot of them call me Dr. Foster anyway. That seems to be the norm. But in any event, they said, we really want to take a course by you in the sociology of religion. So I said, okay. And I went ahead and I got a course set up in the sociology of religion. But then when it became time for the semester to start, 2 students had signed up, just 2 students. That's the problem with special topics courses. So on the third world, I don't know if they would do any better. Maybe, maybe not. But I don't remember, at least where I taught, that it was ever even attempted. I wish it was, because at least we could see something, even if it was only done for experimental purposes. At least we would have some indication of what the interest was of students in the third world. There did not seem to be any to me. I could talk about the third world in my regular classes if I wanted to, but there was a problem in that. Semesters are only 15 weeks where I was. You only have so many hours allotted to each course. You've got to finish up your material within those hours. You can't go beyond and say, please, please give me 2 more weeks. Won't happen. And most professors wouldn't want it anyway. They want to take a vacation. You know, we all need vacations. But if I allotted more time to teaching about the third world, that would simply take away time that I needed to devote to talking about the regular content of that course. So it literally created a kind of contradiction. However much I wanted to talk about the third world and about the subaltern, I really could not, at least not that much. I could a little bit, but not that much. because there wasn't enough time given. It wasn't put into the curriculum. The US curriculum, or curricula, I should say, are mostly focused on the US. And the US still continues to define itself as a North American, Anglo-American country, even though we are just as much a Latin American country. I mean, Latin America, Mexico is just a couple of miles down the road for me, as I've repeated too many times here. So I don't know what the solution is. Perhaps there is no solution. Perhaps this is just another one of the many contradictions of capitalism that that we end up in a situation where the primary oppressor of the third world, the United States, the primary financier of the war in Gaza, the United States, wants to talk mostly about itself, the United States. It's a contradiction, but I guess it makes sense. I mean, why would you want to talk about places that you have oppressed, or even that you had a hand in oppressing? When I was in elementary school, we used to sing a song during our special assemblies. And I'm not going to torture you with singing it. Well, my voice isn't that bad, but in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. The idea was that Columbus discovered America. No, he did not. You could argue, well, of course, the Native Americans, the Inuit, etc., were here already. But even if you're talking about people from Europe, you could argue that the Roman Empire discovered America. In archaeological excavations, Roman coins have been found. Or you could argue that the Vikings discovered America. The Vikings came to North America before Columbus. What Columbus was a monster in terms of how he treated Native Americans, but aside from his own disgusting personality, he was literally the conqueror of America. And so when I discussed Columbus in my classes, I always referred to him as Columbus the Conqueror. And then I would explain why I used that name. Most students had never considered that possibility before. That was the beginning of how the US treated the third world. Now, there really was no such thing as the third world in its modern connotation back when Columbus was around. But I think it is fair to call North America at the time Columbus was here a part of the third world. It certainly was not developed, and it had no prospect of developing, but for that matter, Europe was not developed either, so it's hard really to say. But it showed that kind of Amerocentrism, as we call it, a view of the world centered on the United States, which was prevalent even then. And it has continued till the present day. Will it continue into the future? Well, honestly, that is up to us. Entirely up to us. We have the agency to choose to make a change. We don't have to tolerate the United States viewing itself as the greatest country in the world. or we don't have to tolerate the United States marginalizing Spanish-speaking people by calling itself an Anglo-American country, an English-speaking country, which, again, it legally is not. And yet, well, I've never seen any data on it, but if I had to guess, it would be that most Americans actually believe that English is the official language of the US, which is, to me, really, really troubling. I mean, I wish that were not the case, and I wish there were a way that I could change it, but I can't. And I'm not hopeful, because based on where I see the United States now, I'm not making a historical prediction, because history literally does not repeat itself. But now, just now, I don't see how the United States is moving in the direction of inclusivity. Most colleges and universities have an office for inclusivity, often called by different names. But how inclusive are they? Usually, they try to be inclusive of people of various backgrounds in the college or university, whether students, faculty, or staff, but not inclusive of the world as a whole. So that's the basis for my pessimism, because I don't see us now moving in a better direction. We can't make predictions about the future. The future is left to be unwritten, as the saying goes. But if we are not going in the right way now, or what I think is the right way now, then how are we going to end up at a destination which is more diverse? For the time being, this has been Mark, by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D., for the Institute for Dialectical Meta-Realism. Have a pleasant day and an even better day tomorrow.